So in part 1, I said that in part 2, we would be moving away from the statistical milestones and into discussion of the first roller coasters of specific models. This video is obviously not going to include every model ever, as that would take ages, but rather ones that I consider very big and important ones. If you haven't seen part 1, you should go check that out, but it doesn't really matter what order you watch them in, so let's get into it. We're going to start off with B&M and eventually move to other manufacturers. Perhaps B&M's flagship model was the Invert. Aero was the first to put the train under the track with their suspended coaster model that debuted in 1981, and a mere 13 years later, in 1994, B&M unveiled their take on the model, called the inverted coaster. This model would be able to go upside down and do all sorts of crazy elements. The first invert would go to Six Flags Great America in Illinois and would be called Batman the Ride. The layout consisted of a twisted drop, a loop, a zero-G roll, another loop, and then some helixes and corkscrews. Oh, and this bat clone model was cloned 12 times and called Batman the Ride 6 of those times. I'm not a huge fan of these bat clones, but most people seem to love them for their intense ride experience. Quick note, I'm not going to be including the floorless model in this video, as it is essentially the same thing as the looper, just with no floor. Funny enough, B&M actually made stand-up coasters before they made sit-down coasters, but few of their stand-ups remain, as most have either been converted into floorless coasters or torn down. B&M's first sit-down looper, however, would go to Busch Gardens, Tampa, and be called Kumba, which means roar in the African Congo language, which is a really fitting name because just listen to this thing go. The coaster has a beautiful color scheme and picturesque interlocking corkscrews. It was also the first roller coaster to feature a dive loop. Kumba received immensely positive reception and is still running successfully today, though it has been very much outclassed at its own park. I touched on this in the previous video, but along with being the first roller coaster to feature a vertical drop, Oblivion at Alton Towers was the first B&M dive coaster, a model that has riders pause at the top of their intimidating vertical drop. The rest of the layout usually consists of some drawn-out inversions and helixes, though Oblivion has none. Like I said in the last video, Oblivion is an incredibly short ride and has been outclassed by the later and greater B&M dive models. Another quick note, the B&M Giga won't be on here either, as it is just a scaled up hyper, and hardly any have been built due to their extreme prices and massive amounts of land needed. But if you really want to know, it was Leviathan at Canada's Wonderland. It's not saying the hypercoaster isn't expensive though, because it is. In fact, B&M is definitely one of the more expensive manufacturers, but they also make incredibly reliable coasters, unlike some others. Anyhow, Aero had already made the first hypercoaster in 1989 with Magnum XL200, then Morgan gave it a shot in 1996, and Intamin and B&M in 1999. B&M's first was Apollo's Chariot, a massive roller coaster that mixed airtime-filled camelbacks with positive G-inducing helixes, and also goosed a model. The hypercoaster is widely considered as one of the best coaster models out there, and there have been 15 built as of today, all some of the best coasters in the world. B&M's flying coaster is similar to their inverted coaster, as in it has 4-cross seating and the seats are under the track. However, in this model, riders face the ground as they traverse through forceful inversions and swooping turns. These models are most notable for the pretzel loop inversion, possibly the most intense inversion in the world, the most notorious being Six Flags Magic Mountain's Tatsu. Unlike the other Superman Ultimate Flight clones, which were just slapped onto flat ground, the Over Georgia clone, which was the first, was built for its terrain. Because of this, it is considered the superior Superman Ultimate Flight clone, but as for the best flying coaster in the world, that would have to go to Flying Dinosaur at Universal Studios Japan. That thing just looks insane. There's a reason that B&M has more coaster models on here than anyone else. That's because they have yet to produce a failed model. With other manufacturers, you have a few models here and there that don't sell very well, but that has never been the case with B&M. They are without a doubt one of the manufacturers to go to if you want a quality roller coaster. Aero was the first to put riders on the sides with their 4D coaster in X2, and S&S followed suit with their 4Ds and later their free spins. Intamin had already tried their hand at the wing coaster in 2007 with Furious Baco, which was also launched, but it was considered a rough ride and ultimately a failure because Intamin has yet to sell another. In 2012, B&M gave it a shot with a Raptor at Italy's Gardaland. B&M's wings are considered glass-smooth rides and are an example of yet another wildly successful B&M model. In 2015, they even added a launch to a wing coaster with Thunderbird at Holiday World. Let's move on to some Vekomas. The infamous SLC, the Hang and Bang. the torture device. This model is the most widely despised model among coaster enthusiasts. The majority of these rides track very poorly and have awful, bulky, over-the-shoulder restraints. These coasters actually can be decent when they have proper track work and vest restraints, as seen with the Great Nor'easter, but this is sadly not usually the case. This was Vekoma's try on a coaster that hung under the track, and the first came in 1994 at Belgium's Walibi Holland. These models actually have pretty good looking layouts, with the rollover inversion unique to the model and back-to-back inline twists at the end, but riders are too busy trying to prevent their head from pinballing back and forth against the restraint. Unfortunately, this model was very, very widely cloned, because if a park couldn't afford a B&M Invert, they just got one of these instead. Nearly 40 of these were built. That's just... Thankfully, Vekoma has recently released their new and improved suspended coaster model, which is glass smooth and with lap bar restraints. The one thrill coaster that has been cloned more than the Vekoma SLC is the Vekoma Boomerang. Over 50 of these have been built. Over 50. The layout is very simple. Riders are taken backwards up a usually 115-foot tall slope, then released. They travel through the station and into a cobra roll followed by a loop, and then you get to do the whole thing backwards. They look to be solid rides, but it just gets so repetitive seeing these things everywhere. Vekoma even made a scaled-up inverted version of this ride in 2001, but the model didn't catch on as much. The first of these was built at Six Flags Mexico in 1984, though technical difficulties delayed the opening for a long time, so the first to open was the Boomerang at Parkz, so you can really give the credit to whichever you think deserves it. Vekoma in the 80s and 90s sucked. They basically cloned their boomerangs and SLCs around the world with a few loopers and inverted boomerangs thrown in. Their kiddie coasters were fine, but they're kiddie coasters. Vekoma slowly started improving their craft with their Mine Train coasters and their Disney coasters. They took a big leap in 2010 with Battlestar Galactica at Universal Studios Singapore, but it wasn't until 2016 that we saw what Vekoma could be. Formula is a new-gen Vekoma looper, specifically a Space Warp model. These new-gen Vekomas are silky smooth with strong positives, whippy inversions, and powerful ejector airtime. We have yet to see one of these new gens pop up in the US, but as of now there are many in Europe and Asia, and more popping up every year. We may get a taste in 2023. In the 1960s and 70s, the Aero Mine Train was the theme park ride that Parkz had to have. It provided a fun, scenic experience and was really the model that got Aero rolling. These rides usually feature 2 or 3 lift hills and nice wooded settings. The first of these came in 1966 at Six Flags Over Texas. It only has a max speed of 35 miles an hour and is considered a great family coaster, but for its time it was definitely a thrilling ride. Vekoma has since carried on the Mine Train design. I already talked about this coaster in part 1, as it was the first coaster to feature 2 inversions, but it still deserves a mention here as the first Aero looper. This model dominated the coaster industry through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and is still one of the most successful coaster models to date. In 1981, Kings Island opened the Bat, the first Aero suspended coaster. Cars would hang under the track and swing from side to side during every change of direction. Because the ride was the prototype model, it was plagued with mechanical issues. Due to Aero thinking it would be a good idea not to bank the turns, the cars could swing up to 100 degrees sideways. The unbanked turns also put a ton of stress on the track, and the Bat was shut down just 2 years after it opened. Aero would go on to improve their suspended coaster model, and Kings Island even bought another one 10 years later, also called the Bat. Sadly, the Aero suspended coaster is a dying breed and may not last much longer. This is going to be the only Intamin model on this list, as I don't think there are really any other models that have produced enough coasters to go on here. The Intamin Blitz, now known as the LSM Launch Coaster, but I mean come on, Blitz sounds so much cooler, is one of the most beloved coaster models out there. These intense coasters feature powerful launches, whippy inversions, and amazing airtime hills. The first of these was Maverick at Cedar Point. Opening in 2007, this coaster stood at barely over 100 feet tall and proved that coasters don't have to be massive to be great rides. It was all about the elements. The Intamin Blitz coaster is Intamin's most successful model to date, and more are opening up every year. Well, that's all I have for you today. If you think there are any models I didn't mention that warranted a mention, let me know down in the comments. And who knows, maybe if there are enough, I'll even do a part 3. Farewell.